guys. Tonight, we drift into a world where money, power, and sheer ridiculous creativity meet in candlelit halls and smoky tax offices. Imagine the medieval countryside outside your window, carts rumbling along mud-clogged roads, the faint scent of roasting meat, a chant floating from a stone chapel. In this world, taxes weigh heavily on peasants, but the wealthy play by an entirely different rule book. They invent loopholes so bizarre that you can't help but smile, even as you realize you probably wouldn't survive 5 minutes under their system. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're awake enough, drop a comment with where you are and what time it is right now. I love knowing who's out there listening in real time. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge through a medieval village, rough cobblestones pressing underfoot, and notice the uneven flutter of geese waddling across the square. Their feathers gleam white under a fading sun, and you'd think they were just barnyard leftovers. But for the medieval rich, goose feathers weren't just for quills or pillows. They were weapons in the war against taxes. Picture a nobleman, sleeves heavy with embroidery, standing before a tax collector who's trying to tally up everything from his lands. The collector gestures toward sacks of goose down stacked like snowdrifts. By law, feathers, valuable for bedding and clothing, should be taxed. Yet the noble sighs dramatically, lifts a single feather, and whispers that these are not ordinary feathers, but sacred relics blessed by some wandering friar. He even sprinkles a few drops of holy water on them for flair. Suddenly, they shift categories. Not taxable goods, but objects of spiritual devotion. The mainstream fact here: throughout medieval Europe, relics, items linked to saints or holy figures, were often exempt from taxation. Cathedrals stuffed themselves with bones, robes, and sometimes suspiciously convenient splinters of the true cross. If you could convince the authorities that your goods counted as relics, you had a free pass. And feathers, soft and abundant, made perfect candidates. The quirky tidbit: some nobles went so far as to display goose feathers in elaborate reliquaries, those gilded boxes usually reserved for saints' remains. Imagine a feather sitting there, cushioned in gold, while a family smirked about avoiding a massive levy. Historians still argue whether tax collectors truly believed these stories or simply accepted bribes to look the other way. Maybe they rolled their eyes, took the feather as proof, and pocketed a coin on the side. After all, nobody wants to tell a powerful duke that his sacred goose fluff is just pillow stuffing. You can almost smell the irony. Peasants forced to hand over grain, chickens, and even the occasional child labor, while nobles snuggled into feather beds, literally sanctified by loopholes. It's like a medieval version of writing off a hot tub as a medical necessity on your tax return. And it wasn't just feathers. Anything remotely connected to birds carried loophole potential. Swan feathers, for example, had royal associations. In some courts, only the king could own swans, and swan feathers, technically royal property, were exempt from normal duties. A clever noble could borrow swan feathers, claim them as part of the king's grace, and slip free of taxes while still decorating banquets with them. You picture a feast where roasted swans arrive with their wings reattached for presentation, feathers preened as if the bird were still alive. Guests applaud, wine flows, and in some candlelit corner, the steward carefully notes that none of these feathers will ever appear on the tax rolls. They are, after all, holy or royal, depending on which story you prefer. One story whispers of a bishop who used goose feathers to create angel wings for a church play. The props were declared sacred and thus free from taxation. Yet afterward, the wings mysteriously ended up in his private residence, padding his mattress. Practical, yes, but suspicious. You wander on, imagining the piles of parchment recording all this nonsense, ink stains across the page, quills scratching, and at the end, one word in shaky Latin: exempt. It feels almost modern, like a loophole-filled tax code written in legalese nobody understands. The humor comes naturally here. Imagine explaining to a medieval peasant that you're sleeping on a tax-free pillow because it's technically part of an angel costume. Or worse, imagine being the peasant taxed on your last handful of oats while overhearing a noble boasting about his feather loophole. If anyone deserved a fluff-filled pillow, it wasn't the duke. It was the farmer sleeping on straw. There's also something almost rebellious in these feather stories. Taxes, after all, were power. To escape them meant you had bent the system in your favor. Nobles reveled in that feeling. By declaring feathers relics, they weren't just saving money, they were flaunting their ability to twist both church and state with a single goose. And you? You're still trudging along those cobblestones, a bit sleepy now, imagining the absurd sight. An entire warehouse of feathers labeled, "Do not touch, holy relics." The air is thick with dust and down, drifting through candlelight like snowflakes. In a way, it's soothing, as if the feathers themselves are trying to lull you to sleep, just as they lulled nobles into dreams of wealth preserved from taxation. You may even chuckle, lightly, quietly, at the thought of goose farmers pitching their wares to aristocrats not as betting, but as divinely inspired investments. It's the medieval equivalent of selling a tax-sheltered mutual fund, except fluffier. By the time you leave the village square, the image has settled. Noble families tucked in under feather-padded blankets, mumbling bedtime prayers of thanks, not for salvation, but for loopholes that let them keep more coins jingling in their coffers. You walk further along those cobbled lanes, the evening air cooling against your skin, and the torchlight flickers against uneven stone walls. In the distance, you notice the outline of a manor house with unusually narrow slits cut into the facade. At first glance, they seem defensive, arrow loops perhaps, but step closer and you realize they're windows. Crooked, awkward, sometimes triangular, sometimes crescent-shaped. And then the truth dawns. These aren't architectural flourishes born of genius. They're tax loopholes carved in stone. Because in medieval times, even sunlight could be taxed. The mainstream fact: several towns in late medieval Europe, most notoriously in England after the Norman period, levied a window tax. It wasn't universal, but when enforced, the principle was simple. The more windows your home had, the more you owed. The taxman counted visible openings like he was tallying cows, and your bill rose accordingly. Rich households with their grand halls lined with shining panes of glass were juicy targets. Now here comes the quirky tidbit. Wealthy families often tried to dodge the fee by building windows that were technically not windows. A square hole? Taxable. But an elongated slit so narrow you couldn't stick your arm through? Maybe it's just ventilation. A circular opening glazed with translucent horn? Perhaps it's decorative art, not a taxable aperture. One noble family in France allegedly built diamond-shaped cutouts, then claimed they were heraldic symbols carved into the wall rather than windows. The tax collectors, exhausted and underpaid, sometimes let it slide. Historians still argue whether the window tax was really about revenue or about controlling ostentation? Was it a genuine attempt to fill royal coffers, or just another way for kings to remind nobles that even daylight came at a cost? Picture yourself standing in one of these oddly shaped chambers. You tilt your head, trying to peer out through a slit that gives you just enough of the outside world to spot a passing ox cart. The room feels dim, heavy, almost dungeon-like, yet the family living here congratulates themselves on beating the taxman. "What a view," they mutter, staring at half a tree trunk. The irony deepens at night, when candles must be lit in every corner to make up for the lack of proper windows. So in avoiding one tax, they burn through another expense: wax. And wax, of course, had its own levies, especially in ecclesiastical contexts. It's the kind of circular logic only medieval loopholes could produce. You save a penny on sunlight only to spend a fortune keeping the dark at bay. There's a certain comedic charm to this. Imagine medieval architects brainstorming. What if we tilt the window sideways? Or make it star-shaped? The collector won't know what to call it. It's like today's accountants inventing categories for home office furniture that suspiciously includes a new gaming chair. And if you thought that was absurd, one lord supposedly built false windows painted onto his plaster walls, bright frescoes mimicking panes of glass. When questioned, he argued that his home clearly had plenty of light without paying extra for the real thing. Did the taxman roll his eyes and move on? Maybe. Or maybe he wrote a new regulation forbidding painted windows, the medieval equivalent of a loophole patch. As you pace through this shadowy hall, the air feels slightly stale from lack of circulation. You realize peasants outside would laugh at this entire charade. They had no windows at all, just smoke holes and thatched roofs, and nobody bothered taxing those. Taxes always fell heaviest on those who could least avoid them. Yet nobles, with their angled windows and creative masons, turned daylight into a legal puzzle. The social consequences ripple outward. By the 17th century, long after medieval days, the English window tax had grown so infamous that it shaped architecture permanently. Whole generations bricked up windows to save money, leading to those strange houses you still see in Britain, perfectly symmetrical except for a few blacked-out gaps. People called it the tax on light and air. You can almost hear the complaints echoing backward into our medieval corridor. But tonight, you're not rushing to solve it. You just picture yourself in a dimly lit chamber, cool stone against your palm, candle wax dripping slowly beside you. The window, if you can call it that, is more suggestion than opening, a slice of starlight no bigger than your hand. Somehow, the darkness feels gentle, almost protective, as if the loophole itself is inviting you to rest. And maybe that's the joke hidden here. Nobles spent fortunes convincing everyone that they were saving money, carving starbursts and slits into walls, while peasants slept peacefully under roofs with no taxes at all. Who really won? You decide as you drift further into the hall, where each crooked opening offers just a hint of night air, enough to breathe, enough to dream. Your footsteps echo as you leave that crooked windowed hall behind, and the scent in the air shifts, earthy, briny, and unmistakably sharp. You follow it through narrow lanes until you find yourself in a storeroom where wooden barrels are stacked in neat rows, each heavy with glittering crystals. It takes a moment to realize you're standing in front of salt, the medieval treasure more precious than gold in some places. Salt preserved meat through long winters, flavored otherwise bland meals, and even carried ritual meaning. Kings and bishops fought over salt rights the way modern nations wrestle over oil. But with its high value came high taxation and salt duties filled royal coffers across Europe. For peasants, salt was often unaffordable in large amounts, rationed, scraped, stretched thin. For the rich, however, there was always a loophole. The mainstream fact here, in many medieval regions, salt was classified as a taxable commodity, especially in France, where the hated gabelle made salt one of the kingdom's most resented levies. Nobles technically owed too, but they had tools to avoid paying. Now, the quirky tidbit. Some aristocrats declared their mountains of salt not as trade goods or household stores, but as holy offerings. If the barrels were presented as destined for consecration, or claimed to be gifts for the upkeep of altars, they slipped neatly into tax-exempt categories. And once the taxman's back was turned, the salt conveniently made its way into the Lord's kitchens instead. Historians still argue whether these declarations fooled anyone, or whether collectors simply lacked the authority to challenge claims of holiness. Who dares accuse a duke of lying about his donations to God? You picture the absurdity. A noble kneeling before a chest of salt, sprinkling a few grains on a chapel step, then smugly carting the rest to his banqueting hall. See, he could insist, it's an offering. Technically true, just not quite in the way the church imagined. As you wander among those barrels, you notice the cool tang in the air, like the scent of a seaside breeze. Salt piles sparkle in dim torchlight, glittering like a hoard of jewels. Imagine servants scooping handfuls into cooking pots, preparing lavish feasts of cured hams, cheeses, and preserved fish, all technically tax-free because someone muttered the right blessing over them. The comic edge is clear. It's the medieval equivalent of writing off your wine cellar as religious supplies. Or better yet, counting a caviar stash as holy incense. And the loophole didn't just save money. It reinforced a noble's image as pious. Declaring resources for God was the ultimate double dip, less tax and more prestige. Some records hint at nobles building small chapels on their estates precisely for this trick. Storehouses could be labeled as chapel annexes, filled to bursting with sacred salt. Priests might be paid off with a portion of the goods, or at least with a hearty dinner afterward. Meanwhile, peasants trudged to market, coughing up precious coins for a tiny pinch of the same substance. The unfairness feels heavy, yet you can't help but smile at the sheer creativity. Salt transformed from seasoning into salvation, at least in the legal sense. One tale, possibly exaggerated, tells of a noblewoman who insisted that salt crystals resembled tears of angels. She kept entire chests labeled with that phrase, claiming they belonged not to her household, but to heaven itself. Did the tax collectors dare to open them? Apparently not. You trail your fingers across one of the barrels, the wood rough and cool. In your mind, it isn't just salt inside. It's a vault of preserved loopholes, each grain a tiny rebellion against royal accountants. And in the candlelight, the crystals seem to shimmer more brightly the longer you watch, as though the loophole itself has sanctified them. There's a softness here, despite the sharp tang. You imagine the hush of servants tiptoeing through storerooms, careful not to disturb the holy piles. The silence of salt is comforting. It doesn't rustle, doesn't clink, just rests quietly, waiting, almost like a snowy drift frozen in time. And as you lean into the image, you find your breath slowing. Perhaps that's the real offering here. Not coins or prayers, but calm. Even if the loophole was absurd, the salt, steady and sparkling, whispers of stillness. The salt storeroom fades behind you, and your path leads toward the muffled sound of splashing water. You push open a carved wooden door and a wave of warm, fragrant steam rolls over you. Inside, a noble's private bath glimmers in torchlight. Marble steps descend into a basin filled not with plain water, but with something rich and amber. You lean closer, catch a sweet tang on the air, and realize it's wine. Not just any wine either. This is deep red, the kind usually poured into silver goblets at feasts. Tonight, though, it swirls lazily in a bath as noble bodies sink into it with self-satisfied sighs. The mainstream fact: in late medieval and early Renaissance Europe, wine taxes were among the most lucrative for rulers. Import duties, tavern levies, vineyard tithes, all ways to squeeze profit from the drink of choice for nobles and clergy alike. Even wealthy households owed taxes on the volume they consumed. But here comes the quirky tidbit. Some aristocrats discovered that wine used for medical purposes was exempt or lightly taxed. And what better medical use than soaking your body in it? Wine baths were recommended by certain physicians for skin health, digestion, and spiritual cleansing. The more extravagant the household, the more barrels disappeared into tubs under the guise of therapy. Historians still argue whether these baths were genuinely believed to heal, or whether they were merely excuses to dodge taxes while indulging in luxury. Was it medicine, or was it just nobles giggling in hot Merlot? You settle on the edge of the basin, steam curling around you, and imagine the ridiculous scene. A duke reclines, shoulders slick with burgundy, insisting to a clerk, No, this isn't a drinking stash, it's my prescription." A physician nods solemnly, perhaps pocketing a gold coin, while servants roll in fresh barrels labeled remedies. The comedy writes itself. It's the medieval version of claiming your Netflix subscription as a mental health expense, or writing off chocolate as vitamin intake. And in this world, it worked. There are whispers of noble women swearing by wine baths for beauty. They believed the tannins softened skin, that the liquid warded off blemishes. One Italian countess allegedly filled entire courtyards with casks for her weekly soaks, declaring herself reborn after every plunge. And conveniently, she never paid the crown a penny in duties for her healing vintages. You dip your fingers in, feel the imagined warmth, and let your senses play. The liquid clings heavier than water, its scent earthy and full, rising in waves. Around the room, mosaics catch torchlight, glimmering with golden tesserae. Shadows ripple like dancers across the walls. Servants tiptoe carefully, pouring more wine in from pitchers, terrified of splashing their masters. And beyond the absurdity, there's a subtle irony. Peasants outside rarely drank wine at all, surviving on thin beer and water. For them, a single cup of vintage was luxury. Meanwhile, their lords soaked whole bodies in the stuff, then called it medicine to avoid paying taxes. Another image comes to mind. Wine baths, not only for health, but also for spiritual loopholes. In some monasteries, wine used in ritual was also tax-exempt. Nobles eager to stretch definitions might argue that their soaking tubs had spiritual benefits akin to baptism. A wild claim, perhaps, but not out of line with the creative nonsense you've seen already. You can almost hear the gurgle of liquid as another barrel empties into the tub. The noble sighs, murmuring about his aches, while the tax collector scribbles half-heartedly. Maybe he knows it's a sham. Maybe he doesn't care, as long as he gets a sip before leaving. The room is warm, fragrant, and strangely lulling. Wine's aroma has a way of relaxing even without drinking it. You lean back in imagination, steam softening the edges of the world, and the absurd logic of it all makes you smile. Who knew tax loopholes could be so intoxicating? Literally. And just like the nobles sinking into burgundy pools, you let yourself float for a moment. The bath cradles you, warmth seeps into your skin, and the liquid hum of history flows around you. An indulgence, a loophole, a dream. You leave the warm, wine-scented steam behind and drift into a long gallery where tapestries hang heavy against the stone walls. The fabric shimmers faintly with gold thread, catching the glow of torches. You run your hand along one robe displayed on a carved mannequin, and the texture is rich, weighty, more than just clothing. It is wealth woven into cloth. The mainstream fact, in medieval Europe, gold and silver thread were not only luxury markers, but also taxable. Imported dyes, precious embroidery, and woven metals were tallied like treasure. Wearing such things announced your wealth, but also attracted the king's assessors, who wanted their share. Sumptuary laws often dictated who could wear what, with fines levied against those flaunting excess. Now the quirky tidbit. Nobles learned that certain garments could be declared vestments, religious robes worn in spiritual contexts, and thus exempt from taxes or restrictions. So, wealthy households stitched gold thread into cloaks, then claimed these were ceremonial, not personal luxury. Imagine a duke strolling to court draped in shimmering fabric, insisting with a straight face, "Oh, this? Merely a vestment, purely devotional." Historians still argue whether taxmen were gullible or simply intimidated. After all, who challenges a nobleman's supposed piety? Confront him, and you might be accused of blasphemy, a dangerous risk in a world where the church and crown intertwined. You step deeper into the gallery, where mannequins stand in rows dressed like glittering saints. Some robes are patched with literal scraps of liturgical fabric, pieces stolen or purchased from real churches to lend credibility. A cloak might carry a strip of old altar cloth, or a collar sewn with a bishop's discarded silk. Suddenly the garment had the aura of holiness, even if it was destined for feasts rather than sermons. And the comedy emerges. Nobles swanning about banquets in what looked like priestly attire, claiming they were tax-exempt while sipping wine and gnawing roasted pheasant. It's the medieval version of wearing a lab coat to a party so you can write off the whole event as medical research. Some went further. They'd lend out these cloaks during pilgrimage parades or processions, making sure the public saw them as sacred. Later, the same garments would be tucked into wardrobes, worn again during hunting trips or dances. Flexibility was the loophole's greatest strength. One lord, records suggest, designed his hunting outfit with gold crosses embroidered across the chest. When questioned, he claimed it was religious armor, meant to protect him spiritually in the wild. Never mind the tax-free embroidery, he also got the benefit of appearing devout. You can almost hear the rustle of fabric in this hall, the swish of heavy cloaks brushing against stone. The gold threads glint like tiny fires in the dim light, mesmerizing in their detail. Each garment hums with stories, of seamstresses working late into the night, of nobles smirking as taxmen reluctantly marked the items exempt. The irony, of course, is that genuine vestments worn by humble monks were plain and simple, often scratchy wool dyed dull colors. Meanwhile, aristocrats paraded in fake vestments sparkling with wealth, all while ducking their fiscal duties. And yet, the loophole worked. Like the goose feathers you saw earlier, or the wine baths, clothing became both shield and performance. Taxation wasn't just about money. It was about appearances, and the rich knew how to stage manage those appearances perfectly. As you linger, the robes seem to sway gently, as if stirred by an invisible breeze. The shimmering gold calms the eye, its gleam soft but steady, like fireflies caught in fabric. The gallery is hushed, solemn, but also faintly ridiculous. A hall of costumes worn not for faith, but for finance. And slowly, as you let your gaze soften, the absurdity melts into serenity. The glittering threads, the hush of cloth, the long patience of tailors, it all blends into a kind of sleepy lullaby, a cloak of exemptions, draped not over shoulders tonight, but over your thoughts, dimming them into drowsy stillness. The gallery of glittering cloaks fades, and you find yourself stepping onto a narrow dirt road. The sound of rushing water reaches your ears, or so you think. But as you follow the noise, the stream grows faint, replaced by laughter, and you realize there is no river here. What you've come upon instead is a toll booth, set up boldly in the middle of the road, demanding payment for crossing a bridge. Except there is no bridge. The mainstream fact, medieval Europe was crisscrossed by toll stations, many legitimately tied to bridge upkeep. Since bridges were costly to build and maintain, landowners often charged travelers a fee to cross. In principle, these funds kept the structures safe, but in practice, the system was ripe for abuse. Lords declared rights to collect tolls even when no bridge existed, pocketing the coins while travelers still waded through rivers. The quirky tidbit, nobles and their families, of course, exempted themselves. They collected bridge taxes from merchants and peasants while merrily crossing for free, sometimes on horseback, splashing through shallows that never even saw a plank of wood. To justify the absurdity, they'd argue that a bridge had once stood here, or a bridge was planned in the future. Thus, a phantom bridge created very real revenue. Historians still argue whether these phantom tolls were tolerated because rulers couldn't enforce fairness everywhere, or whether monarchs themselves encouraged them as a way to keep lesser nobles loyal. After all, a lord who gets to siphon coins from passing carts is a lord unlikely to rebel against his king. You pause near the toll booth, a shabby wooden hut with a painted sign that reads "Bridge Fee." A guard lounges lazily nearby, his spear leaning against the wall. When a merchant arrives, leading a donkey loaded with sacks, the guard steps forward, hand outstretched. Coins clink into his palm, and the merchant trudges onward, straight into a shallow ford where the donkey's hooves splash in mud. No bridge, no repairs, just a fantasy tax. It's almost comical. Imagine today being charged a toll to cross an invisible highway, or paying for Wi-Fi that never connects. Medieval loopholes weren't just clever, they were sometimes outright scams disguised in legal robes. The hypocrisy deepens when you picture nobles exempting themselves. A gilded carriage rolls past, curtains drawn. The guard salutes, but no coins change hands. After all, the bridge tax doesn't apply to the people who invented it, only to everyone else. There's a peculiar charm to the scene, though. The toll booth stands lonely, torches flickering against the night air, as if it believes in the bridge more than anyone else. Its very existence insists, a bridge belongs here. And in a way, the idea of a bridge is more profitable than the wood and stone itself. Why bother building one when you can tax the dream of it forever? Some stories even tell of travelers who protested, refusing to pay for what didn't exist. But most peasants lacked power to resist. A spear at your ribs was persuasive enough. The wealthy merchants might grumble, but they knew the loophole worked both ways. If they ever climbed into nobility, they'd want their own phantom bridge. And so the tolls continued. Coins collected, bridges unbuilt, rivers crossed barefoot until the system became a kind of sleepy rhythm in itself. Pay, wade, move on. Pay, wade, move on. As you stand there, listening to the splash of unseen travelers in the dark, it almost lulls you. The steady plunk of water against hooves, the faint chime of coins hitting a wooden chest, the rustle of parchment as scribes mark each toll. It's like the heartbeat of medieval finance. A little dishonest, yes, but strangely soothing in repetition. You lean against the toll booth wall, feel the rough grain of wood, and let your eyes close for a moment. Even phantom bridges, it seems, can carry you somewhere. Not across rivers, but across thoughts, into a hazy quiet where loopholes feel less like schemes and more like dreams. The toll booth with its imaginary bridge fades behind you, and soon the air grows sweeter, buzzing faintly with a low hum. You follow the sound, and there, tucked behind hedges and orchards, you find rows of wooden hives. Bees drift lazily in and out, their wings catching the last rays of sun like flecks of gold. The scent of honey hangs thick, sticky, and inviting, and the noble who owns these hives watches proudly from his garden chair. To him, the bees aren't just pollinators, they're accountants, buzzing loopholes into existence. The mainstream fact: in medieval Europe, honey and beeswax were important commodities. Honey sweetened food long before refined sugar was widespread, and wax supplied candles for churches and households alike. Both were taxed heavily, sometimes even tithed to the church as part of obligatory dues. Now the quirky tidbit: wealthy landowners discovered they could classify their beekeeping not as personal enterprise, but as charitable service. If the honey and wax were said to be destined for church candles, for alms to the poor, or for communal feasts, they slipped into exemption categories. Of course, not all the honey went to charity. Much of it wound up bottled, sold, or drizzled over pastries in noble dining halls. Historians still argue whether nobles sincerely gave significant portions away, or whether they fabricated records. Some church archives list suspiciously large honey donations that vanish without trace, suggesting that generosity was more bookkeeping than reality. You stroll closer to the hives, the wooden boxes warm with life. The buzzing grows louder, steady like a lull, and you picture servants harvesting combs by torchlight, sticky hands gleaming. Some of the honey drips into jars marked with painted crosses, destined for holy use. The rest is whisked away to kitchens, conveniently uncounted. The comedy writes itself. Imagine a noble explaining with wide eyes, No, this isn't dessert. It's a sacred candle starter." Meanwhile, his children lick honey straight from the comb behind him. It's the medieval equivalent of writing off a crate of chocolate as community supplies and then hiding it in your pantry. One story tells of a wealthy abbot who kept beehives supposedly to fund parish candles. The wax indeed lit altars, but the honey was fermented into mead and served at monastic banquets. "It's still for the glory of God," he chuckled, raising his mug. And the tax collector could hardly argue when the entire monastery backed the claim. You pause near a hive, the bees circling calmly, and you notice the soothing rhythm of their work. Each tiny insect slips in, slips out, carrying pollen like golden dust. The loophole may have been absurd, but the bees themselves didn't care. They worked steadily, weaving honey regardless of who pocketed the tax savings. And maybe that's the irony. Peasants outside struggled to buy even a small candle of wax, taxed nearly to extinction, while nobles lit entire halls with hundreds of dripping tapers, glowing like small suns. Every flame was on paper, for charity. Yet the peasants' huts remained dark, smoky with rushlights, while noble feasts glittered in honey-bright light. The hives hum softly as you stand still. The air feels thick, warm, almost heavy with sweetness. You imagine the honeycomb's golden cells glistening like stained glass, each drop sticky and shining. The sound of bees becomes hypnotic, steady, soft, endless. Their drone is like a background chant, low and calming, as if nature itself is whispering a lullaby. And as the noble beside you smirks about his charitable bees, you can't help but feel a touch of envy. Not for the loophole, but for the quiet. The bees don't argue, don't scheme. They simply work, their song carrying you deeper into drowsy thought. Honey for taxes, wax for loopholes, bees for peace. The absurdity settles into stillness, as golden and steady as the comb itself. You step away from the gentle hum of the hives, and soon a sharp whistle cuts the air above you. A shadow streaks across the twilight sky, wings spread wide, talons curled. You tilt your head back and see it. A falcon, diving with precision, then circling back to its master. The noble standing nearby lifts a gloved arm, and the bird perches, feathers ruffling like banners in the breeze. To the noble, this is not just a hunting companion. This is a tax-deductible weapon. The mainstream fact, falconry was one of the great medieval status symbols. Kings, dukes, and wealthy knights kept hawks and falcons for hunting, and entire treatises were written on their care. Birds of prey were rare, expensive, and sometimes restricted by law to certain classes of nobility. They weren't just pets. They were displays of prestige. Now the quirky tidbit. Nobles discovered a clever way to avoid taxation on these pricey birds. By classifying them as military equipment, they argued that falcons were tools of defense, not luxury. After all, trained raptors could in theory serve as war assets, delivering messages, intimidating enemies, or hunting to feed troops. In practice, the birds mostly chased rabbits across private estates. But on parchment, every flap of a falcon's wings translated into a deduction. Historians still argue whether kings genuinely entertained the idea of falcons as war instruments, or whether everyone involved simply enjoyed the farce. Some military records list birds alongside swords and spears, suggesting the loophole held official weight. You stroll closer, and the falcon fixes you with a golden eye. Its gaze is piercing, unnervingly calm, as though it knows its worth. You picture clerks struggling to list it on tax rolls. One falcon, classified as combat gear? The ink scratches reluctantly across the page. And then you picture the comedy of it all. A noble seated at a banquet, bird perched nearby, insisting to his guests, "This isn't a pet. This is my army." Meanwhile, the falcon pecks at a drumstick, looking utterly unbothered. It's the medieval equivalent of writing off a purebred show dog as home security equipment. Falconry manuals even offered extra cover. Some claimed falcons trained hunters for military readiness, sharpening reflexes, building discipline. If hunting was preparation for war, then surely falcons were part of national defense. Loophole closed. Argument won. You hear the jingle of tiny bells tied to the bird's ankles, their sound soft and delicate against the wind. The falcon spreads its wings again, lifts into the air, and arcs across the fading sky. For a moment, you forget the absurdity. Its flight is silent, graceful, effortless, like a dream cutting across the horizon. Yet the irony lingers. Peasants paid tithes on chickens, geese, even the eggs they gathered each morning. Nobles, meanwhile, paraded falcons worth more than a peasant's yearly earnings, all while insisting these luxury birds were free of tax. because war. The unfairness is as sharp as the falcon's talons. One tale tells of a duke who allegedly marched into a royal audience flanked not by guards, but by a row of falcons perched on stands. He announced proudly that his troops were ready. The court laughed, but the records list his birds as exempt that year. Whether the king believed him or simply enjoyed the theater is anyone's guess. The falcon wheels overhead once more, then dives back to its perch, feathers rustling as it folds itself neatly. You stand in the hush that follows, the only sound the faint tinkling of bells. There's something calming in the steadiness of the bird. Its focus never wavers. Its presence stills the air around it. The loophole may be absurd, but the falcon itself is anything but. Watching it breathe, feeling the hush of its wings as it settles, you realize the nobles weren't wrong in one sense. These birds are powerful, not as weapons of war, but as creatures that hold you in awe, grounding you in silence. And in that silence, you let yourself linger, lulled by the rhythm of wing and wind, the glide of a bird that somehow carried both taxes and dreams on its back. The falcon's bells fade into the night, and you drift onward through dim corridors lined with flickering torches. The air grows warmer, sweeter, touched with the faint scent of honeyed wax. Soon, you find yourself inside a noble hall where the walls glow gold with candlelight. Great tapers line the tables, squat wax pillars stand in corners, and chandeliers dangle above like fiery crowns. For the wealthy, light is not just a necessity, it is an indulgence, and, conveniently, an exemption. Here lies the mainstream fact. In the Middle Ages, wax was precious. While peasants lit their huts with smoky rushlights or oil lamps, nobles feasted under beeswax candles that burned clean and bright. Wax production required enormous amounts of honeycombs, which meant hives, beekeepers, and land. It was costly, rare, and usually reserved for churches and castles. The quirky loophole. Nobles realized that if candles were framed as spiritual necessities, they could avoid market dues and taxes. After all, light symbolized the divine. Churches relied on candles for rituals, vigils, and sacred ceremonies. So why shouldn't a lord's dining hall, or, let's be honest, his bathroom, be equally holy? By declaring barrels of wax destined for God's glory, nobles turned candle shopping into an untaxed activity. Historians still argue whether local rulers genuinely tolerated this loophole because they feared divine backlash, or simply because nobles were too powerful to oppose. The records are slippery. Some charters list wax under sacred exemptions, others under taxable luxury. The line between piety and profit blurred as quickly as melting wax on stone floors. You walk between long tables where pools of golden light shimmer. Nobles recline in shadow, their faces warm and drowsy, bathed in candle glow. Each flame quivers, and you notice how hypnotic it becomes. The soft dance of fire that bends and straightens, like a heartbeat made visible. And you imagine the irony. Peasants paying grain tithes while their lords claim tax-free mountains of wax to host candlelit feasts. Somewhere, a merchant clerk scratches his head, staring at records that say, 200 weight of wax for devotional purposes? Perhaps he shrugs, adds a flourish of ink, and mutters, "May the saints forgive them." There are whispers of nobles abusing the loophole extravagantly. One count supposedly lined his corridors with so many votive candles that guests joked they were walking through a cathedral. Another allegedly insisted that even his hunting lodge required ritual candles so he could light them while tracking deer. It's the medieval version of writing off scented luxury candles as a religious expense. You picture a lord explaining, "No, truly, this lavender wax pillar is essential for my eternal soul." Meanwhile, the flame sputters, releasing a soothing perfume that says less sanctity and more spa day. The longer you linger in the hall, the more the flames blur together. Hundreds of tiny golden crowns sway in unison. Your eyes grow heavy, lulled by their rhythm. The warmth presses against your skin, and the scent of honey grows thicker, wrapping you like a blanket. There's something comforting in the absurdity of it all. A loophole that allowed nobles to bask in glow while avoiding dues reminds you how human they were, always looking for the easy way out, even if it meant pretending every dinner was a religious ceremony. You almost smile. It's the kind of loophole you might have tried too, if your nights were this dim and wax this rare. The candles crackle softly, wax dripping down their sides, pooling in tiny rivers. One drop falls with a faint hiss as it hits stone. You watch it cool, hardening into a pale curl that clings to the floor. Time itself seems to slow, stretching between the flickers. The feast is over now, but the flames remain, steady and unwavering. They sway like lullabies in the air, carrying you deeper into stillness. You take one last look around at the endless sea of light, tax-free, holy, and utterly mesmerizing. The waxy glow fades, and you wander outside, slipping into cooler air where crickets chirp in rhythmic pulses. Ahead stretches an estate garden, vast and overgrown, its hedges so tall they swallow the stars. You step through an iron gate and suddenly find yourself in the heart of a labyrinth. The paths twist and double back, ivy hangs heavy, and the air is damp with the smell of moss and earth. Here's the historical reality. Medieval nobles adored elaborate gardens, not only as symbols of wealth, but as stages for performance and leisure. The richest among them shaped hedges into mazes, geometric patterns, or walls that hid secret fountains. These weren't just patches of herbs and roses. They were massive undertakings, sometimes requiring entire crews of gardeners. And now for the loophole. Nobles would claim these labyrinths as defensive fortifications. Yes, the same way they might register a moat or a stone wall. Why? Because fortifications were often tax-exempt or eligible for subsidies, since they were framed as serving the public good, protecting the land and its people. Never mind that the hedge maze was more likely to trap confused servants than invading armies. Historians still argue whether local rulers genuinely believed in this fiction or merely allowed it to persist because confronting nobles was costly. Some chronicles suggest that lords even built watchtowers inside their gardens to strengthen the illusion of fortification. Yet other records mock these efforts openly, describing noble mazes as green prisons for lost children and wandering cooks. You wander through the hedge-lined corridors, listening to the muffled echo of your footsteps on gravel. The plants loom higher than you expected, whispering in the breeze. The maze is so quiet that you almost believe it could double as a defensive trap. After all, what invader wouldn't lose their patience trying to find the right turn, while knights laughed from above? Some nobles staged plays or courtly love games in their labyrinths, further blurring the line between entertainment and defense. You imagine a duchess strolling ahead, deliberately taking wrong turns, while her suitors stumble behind her in confusion. At the same time, her steward is filing paperwork with local officials claiming, "Yes, this is entirely for the realm's protection." It's both hilarious and strangely clever. Tax loopholes often live in gray areas, half serious, half absurd, and a hedge maze as a castle wall feels like the purest example. If you've ever claimed that buying video games was educational, you know the vibe. The deeper you walk, the quieter it becomes. Leaves rustle, brushing against one another like 1,000 whispered prayers. Your path turns again, narrowing into a curve, and suddenly you're not sure whether you've gone forward or backward. The moonlight peeks through slivers of leaves above, painting thin silver stripes across your shoulders. Somewhere, a nightingale begins to sing. Its notes float high and lonely above the twisting greenery, reminding you that even here, lost in tax-dodging hedges, nature keeps its own rhythm. Your mind drifts back to the noble who first thought, "If I just plant more hedges, surely that counts as a fortress." Maybe he believed it, or maybe he winked as he said it, knowing exactly how flimsy his argument was. Either way, he got to enjoy long moonlit strolls without paying levies on his garden. And you, centuries later, are still tracing the outline of his clever little trick. The path narrows one last time. The air smells sharp, like cut greenery after rain. You reach a fountain hidden in the maze's center, its water dripping steadily. The sound is slow, steady, hypnotic, like the tick of a clock that refuses to hurry. You sit at the fountain's edge, watching ripples shimmer under the moonlight. And as you linger, the stillness wraps around you. Hedge walls rise like protective arms. The fountain whispers lullabies, and the maze, supposedly a fortress, becomes a cradle for sleep. The fountain's ripples fade, and you leave the maze through a narrow arch cut into the greenery. Beyond it, you enter a stone hall lined with tapestries, bright reds, deep purples, and shimmering silks that catch the torchlight like liquid flame. The air smells faintly of spice, cinnamon mixed with cloves, and you realize you've walked into the world of imported luxuries. The medieval rich loved nothing more than flaunting exotic goods: silk from China, pepper from India, ivory from Africa. These items traveled across treacherous routes: the Silk Road, desert caravans, storm-tossed seas, and by the time they reached Europe, their prices had ballooned to absurd heights. That should have meant fat taxes for the crown, since imported luxuries were prime targets for tariffs. But of course, the wealthy found ways to slip through the cracks. The trick? Labeling them as diplomatic gifts. A noble might receive a shipment of silks and claim, "Oh, these, merely tokens of friendship from a foreign envoy." Not taxable merchandise, you see. Officials often lacked the resources, or the bravery, to question such claims. After all, nobody wanted to accuse a duke of running a side hustle, when he could just as easily say it was an exchange of honor. Historians still argue whether merchants colluded in this scheme or were dragged along unwillingly. Some letters suggest that traders inflated their prices, knowing nobles would dodge taxes by calling the goods gifts anyway. Others hint that entire cargoes were rebranded mid-journey, with captains scribbling over their manifests to transform 10 bolts of silk into diplomatic tokens. You pause by one of the tapestries, its golden thread woven into the shape of a lion crouching in tall grass. The fabric shimmers, so fine you can almost hear it rustle like leaves in the wind. Imagine claiming that something so obviously expensive was just a present. It's like driving home in a brand new luxury car and telling the tax office, "Oh, this. Just a thoughtful gift from my neighbor Steve." The loophole extended beyond silk. Spices, perfumes, and even rare animals slipped under the same excuse. Nobles paraded leopards in their courts, insisting they were diplomatic offerings. Some kept parrots that could mimic human speech, loudly reminding guests they were untaxed. Thank you very much. And there's an almost dreamlike humor in it. You picture a customs officer trying to argue, that elephant clearly didn't fit into a gift bag. Meanwhile, the noble shrugs, sipping wine, as if the enormous beast tied up outside were no different from a box of chocolates. The hall grows quieter as you walk, your footsteps soft on the stone. The spice-scented air lingers, thick and drowsy. In the corner, a chest sits half open, silk spilling out in shimmering waves. You run your fingers over the fabric, smooth as flowing water, and the sensation calms you. Each fold seems to sigh, releasing the tension from your shoulders. Luxury itself becomes a lullaby here, the hush of heavy curtains, the muted clink of golden goblets, the faint perfume of foreign lands clinging to every surface. It all wraps around you in a cocoon of softness. And while nobles argued paperwork and labels to avoid paying their dues, you find yourself drifting in the comfort they created. The loophole might have been absurd, but it left behind an atmosphere rich enough to lull you to sleep. You leave the silk-draped hall behind, the faint spice still clinging to your sleeves, and step into a quieter courtyard where the air smells of hay and candle wax. At first, you think you've wandered into an ordinary farmyard, pigs rooting near troughs, chickens pecking the ground. But then you notice the strange detail. One pig is wearing a little wreath of dried herbs around its neck, as though it's about to conduct a sermon. This is where wealth and religion blur together into loopholes. The noble families who controlled estates owed tithes, essentially a tax, 1/10 of their produce, paid to the church. But livestock was expensive to hand over, and nobles weren't keen to part with their fattest pigs. The workaround? Declare certain animals as ordained offerings or religious symbols, which conveniently exempted them from tithe collectors. So, yes, pigs became priests. Sheep were dubbed sacred flocks. Even cows might be led into church courtyards draped in ribbons, while their owners argued that these beasts were technically part of the religious order now. A tax collector standing there had little choice but to nod along. After all, who wanted to be the one to tell a duke his cow wasn't devout enough? One mainstream fact here is that the medieval tithe system really did demand 1/10 of produce or income from both peasants and nobles. But the wealthy always found ways to reduce what they owed, often by creative interpretation. Tithe barns still stand across Europe, large stone buildings where farmers had to deposit grain or livestock for the church. Yet a noble's barn might look suspiciously empty, despite acres of fertile land. The quirky tidbit is that some records hint at actual ceremonies where livestock were symbolically blessed to strengthen the claim that they couldn't be taxed. Imagine a priest muttering Latin over a pig that's happily chewing an apple core, while a scribe dutifully notes, exempt. Historians still argue whether this loophole was widespread or exaggerated by satirists of the time. Some chroniclers loved poking fun at nobles, and turning pigs into priests might have been their way of mocking aristocratic greed. But a few accounts are so specific, names of farms, even drawings of ribbon-decked animals, that it's hard to dismiss entirely. You picture the scene. A tithe collector trudges up to a manor, quill and ledger in hand. He points at a pig pen and asks for the 10th hog. The noble, leaning casually on his staff, shakes his head. Not that one. That's Brother Oink. He belongs to the church. The collector sighs, scribbles reluctantly, and moves on, probably questioning his career choices. There's a sleepy humor in imagining entire barns of holy animals. A goose honking like a church bell, a sheep solemnly chewing its cud while called Reverend Wool. Nobles leaned heavily on ritual and symbolism, twisting them just enough to protect their wealth. As you stroll further, the courtyard seems to grow softer, quieter. The pigs nestle in straw, their snouts making little grunting noises that almost sound like gentle snores. A hen flutters up onto a beam, feathers rustling like parchment pages. The whole farmyard feels wrapped in a haze of dusk, as though the animals themselves are part of some half-serious monastery. You pause near a wooden trough, listening to the rhythmic sounds, chewing, clucking, the occasional grunt. They settle into your ears like a lullaby, repetitive and earthy. The absurdity fades into comfort. Even if pigs in wreaths never really dodged taxes, the story itself has softened into a kind of rustic dream. And somewhere in the straw, a noble counts his coins, smiling, while Brother Oink snores on unbothered. From the straw-strewn yard of Brother Oink, you wander through a corridor of stone that smells faintly of smoke and lavender soap. You follow your nose until you arrive at the most private of aristocratic chambers, a gilded bathroom. Here, the medieval rich pulled off one of their strangest tricks, turning the very place where they relieved themselves into a sanctuary of tax exemption. Golden chamber pots gleam under torchlight. They aren't just practical vessels, they're treated like relics. Imagine a lord arguing, with a perfectly straight face, that his bathroom implements were sacred vessels, and therefore free from levies. It sounds ridiculous, but wealthy households frequently classified their most lavish items as religious or ceremonial to shield them from collectors. A gold chamber pot was conveniently rebranded as a holy chalice, albeit one with a very awkward purpose. The mainstream historical fact, the medieval church and secular lords imposed furnishing taxes or levies on luxury items, everything from silverware to ornate furniture. Nobles resented these intrusions and looked for creative loopholes. One documented case is how certain chalices, candlesticks, and reliquaries doubled as both devotional tools and luxury decor, blurring taxable versus untouchable. The quirky tidbit is that archaeologists have unearthed chamber pots made of fine metal, even gold-plated ones, in noble residences. Not exactly what you'd expect to find under someone's bed. A few inventories even listed them under household treasures, alongside jewels and crowns. Which begs the question, did someone really try to claim tax immunity on their toilet? Historians still argue whether the sacred chamber pot loophole was ever formally accepted or merely a running joke among clerks and scribes. Some think nobles used the excuse half-seriously, daring collectors to object. Others believe it was satire, mocking the absurd wealth and piety of the upper class. But like our earlier pig priests, the line between truth and parody is blurry. Picture the scene. A tax collector enters a noble bedchamber, pinches his nose, and gestures at a golden vessel near the bed. That, my lord, must be recorded. The noble frowns dramatically. That, dear sir, is not a chamber pot. It is the vessel of purification. The collector, pale but obedient, scribbles a note and hurries away, likely questioning all his life choices. You lean against the stone wall, smiling at the absurdity, while the chamber flickers with torchlight. The golden pots glimmer like stars in a strange constellation of wealth. Outside, the night air presses close, cool and heavy, but inside the chamber, the warmth of fire and the hush of stone make you drowsy. Your imagination drifts further. What if every bathroom had been declared a sacred site? Toilets as shrines, chamber pots as relics, bathwater as holy nectar. Suddenly, Medieval manors resemble temples, with worshippers kneeling before tubs and bowing to privies. It's a ridiculous image, yet strangely soothing. You hear the faint drip of water into a basin, the soft hiss of fire, the echo of your own footsteps muffled on rush-strewn floors. The longer you linger, the more the humor fades into rhythm. Drip, hiss, shuffle, sigh. Like the chamber pots themselves, the ordinary becomes strangely precious. The nobles may have been laughing at the system, but centuries later, you're drifting, lulled by their audacity, watching golden reflections ripple on the walls as if you're inside a shimmering cocoon. And somehow, that ridiculous chalice near the bed seems less like a toilet, more like a symbol of how far humans will go to protect their comfort. From the flickering glow of those chamber pots, you drift along a hallway that narrows into a spiral staircase. The steps creak under your weight, and you emerge into a gallery filled with painted shields and heavy traveling cloaks. Here lies another aristocratic trick, the loophole of the false pilgrim. In theory, pilgrimage was a sacred journey. People left their towns, often barefoot, trudging hundreds of miles to holy sites. Pilgrims were granted special privileges, exemptions from certain local taxes, protection from tolls, and sometimes free lodging in monasteries. But the wealthy, with their usual knack for creative loopholes, turned pilgrimage into a clever shield. The mainstream historical fact: across Europe, pilgrims carried special letters of passage or wore recognizable badges, like a scallop shell for the Camino de Santiago. These markers granted them freedom from many ordinary dues. Pilgrims could pass without paying bridge tolls, market taxes, or even some judicial fines. It was meant to encourage devotion, but the upper class saw opportunity. So what did some nobles do? They declared themselves to be on perpetual pilgrimage. Imagine a count who never really left his castle, but had a servant trot down to the market with a scallop shell pinned to his hat. Ah, yes, my master is currently en route to Canterbury. That sack of spices? Pilgrim supplies, untaxable. The quirky tidbit is that some lords built entire pilgrim chapels on their estates, claiming they were spiritually en route without leaving home. Others kept wardrobes stuffed with pilgrim cloaks, ready to hand out to relatives whenever a tax collector came sniffing around. At times, noblewomen even styled themselves eternal pilgrims, enjoying exemptions while sitting in their rose gardens sipping watered wine. Historians still argue whether this loophole was consistently tolerated by officials or whether collectors rolled their eyes and demanded proof. Some records suggest local sheriffs tried to crack down, insisting pilgrims show dust on their boots or receipts from shrines. Others hint that enforcement was laughably uneven. If you were rich enough, who dared question your holy journey? You picture a scene. A duchess lounges on a velvet cushion, nibbling candied almonds. A bailiff appears at her gate, demanding tolls for imported cloth. She waves a hand languidly. I am, of course, on pilgrimage to Rome. He stares at her jeweled slippers and untraveled complexion. But what can he do? The badge on her gown gleams. He retreats, muttering about the impossible job of enforcing fairness. There's a sleepy humor in this. Medieval life was already so hard. Muddy roads, aching feet, bad bread, that anyone claiming pilgrimage without moving an inch feels almost like a parody. Yet nobles made it work. Their wealth insulated them from suspicion, turning a deeply spiritual tradition into another stage prop for tax evasion. As you wander this gallery, the shields glimmer dully, and the traveling cloaks sway like shadowy figures on hooks. You almost hear the faint chant of distant pilgrims, boots crunching gravel roads, staffs tapping stone bridges. Against that steady rhythm, the false pilgrims of the nobility seem even more absurd, sleepwalking saints, wandering only in imagination. The longer you stand here, the more the air itself seems to hum with the echo of journeys never taken. You can almost feel the soft scallop badge brushing against your chest, as if you too are exempt from all worldly duties, permitted to drift freely. Each imagined step away from taxes feels lighter, and your breathing slows in time with that imagined road. For now, you're a pilgrim without moving, a traveler without travel, watching painted saints on the wall smile faintly, as if they too are in on the joke. You drift onward, leaving the gallery of false pilgrims behind. The air cools as you step into a vast stone hall lined with long oak tables. The scent of beeswax and damp parchment seems to linger here, and this is where the final, and perhaps most unsettling, loopholes gather together. The schemes nobles devised to slip past death itself, or at least the taxes that came with it. In many medieval realms, when a noble died, the crown swooped in to claim a hefty inheritance fee, or relief. It was meant as a way to reaffirm loyalty. Heirs paid to officially receive their lands. For the average subject, death duties meant your family might lose half its possessions to feudal lords or to the church. But for the rich, there was always a way around. The mainstream historical fact: in England, heirs often had to pay a relief to inherit property, sometimes equal to a full year's income. In France, succession dues could drain vast fortunes, yet certain nobles engineered elaborate tricks, legal fiction, staged deaths, even endless debts, to make sure their wealth passed untouched. Here's the quirky tidbit. Some aristocrats staged false burials. A lord might be declared dead on parchment, allowing his lands to be quietly transferred to a son or cousin, while he still enjoyed life in a distant villa under another name. Picture him sipping watered wine, chuckling at the thought of the king expecting dues for a man who no longer existed. Others forged documents suggesting debts that conveniently swallowed the estate. Ah, pity, they'd sigh. Nothing left to tax, it's all owed already. Historians still argue whether these shadowy schemes were widespread or isolated to a few daring families. Some say monarchs cracked down hard, sending inspectors to verify burials and account books. Others suggest the authorities looked the other way, unwilling to battle the richest lords who essentially bankrolled their wars. You imagine the absurdities. A widow insisting her husband had died twice, each time conveniently clearing the family estate of dues. A baron, buried in theory, hosting masquerade feasts in practice. Entire libraries filled with forged debts, piles of parchment proving that somehow wealth never really existed in taxable form. It's both comical and slightly eerie. In a world where survival itself was fragile, nobles treated death like another obstacle in the rulebook, something you could negotiate or fudge with clever paperwork. They cheated not only the tax collector, but the very ritual of passing on, twisting mortality into a ledger entry. And as you walk through this great stone hall, the tables seem to stretch on forever, covered in wax seals and dusty contracts. They whisper of lords who never died, at least not on paper, of wealth that passed like smoke through invisible hands. The torches burn lower, shadows lengthening on the walls, and the hall begins to dissolve into stillness. You feel your own breath deepen, steady and unhurried, just as those nobles found ways to linger in their estates. You too linger here, unburdened before letting go. The long hall fades into something softer now. The walls dissolve, and the oak tables melt into the rhythm of your own breathing. You're no longer standing among parchments or candles. You're simply floating in a space where the air feels warm and forgiving, where time itself has slowed down enough for you to rest. Think of how many tricks the nobles invented, all to keep hold of what they already had. Feather loopholes, falcon exemptions, pilgrim cloaks, and chamber pots pretending to be holy relics. Every scheme was a way of clinging, of refusing to let go. And yet, centuries later, all those lords and ladies are gone, their clever contracts scattered like dust. What remains is not the wealth they kept, but the stories they left behind. You don't have to chase those tricks or carry those worries tonight. There are no taxes here, no ledgers, no collectors at the door. Just the easy rhythm of your breath and the gentle weight of stillness wrapping around you. Imagine the quiet night stretching across the fields, stars settling one by one into their places. Imagine cool air drifting through an open window, the sound of leaves brushing softly against each other. You're safe here, unhurried, exactly where you're meant to be. Let each thought grow slower, heavier, until even the stories themselves fade into a gentle blur. The last of the torches in that stone hall flicker out, leaving you in calm darkness. You are free to rest, free to drift, free to let sleep gather you in. And with that, our long wander through strange medieval loopholes comes to its close. May your night be peaceful and your dreams light.